Hi, you're listening to The Sociology Show, a podcast about absolutely anything to do with the wonderful world of sociology. Whether you're a teacher, a lecturer, a student, or just taking a passing interest, this podcast will look at a range of issues from social class, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, religion, crime, education, and anything else that sociology has to offer. My name is Matthew Wilkin, and each episode I will speak to someone working in the field of sociology and let them explain all about their own interests, their research, and their experiences. So, put your earphones in, turn the volume up, and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to The Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2You Sociology, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit their website, which is tutor2you.net/sociology. And there you can pick up revision guides, flashcards, revision videos, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And so on to this episode. At the time of recording, it's Thursday, the 22nd of April, 2021. 4 days ago, plans were announced in the football world of a new European Super League to start as soon as possible. Following huge outcry and criticism of the announcement, the plans have begun to fall apart within just 48 hours, with Chelsea firstly pulling the plug and then other clubs choosing to opt out as well. To discuss the sociological relevance and implications of this event, I spoke to Dr Mark Doidge from the University of Brighton. Hi Mark, thank you very much for joining me.
Hi Matthew, how are you doing?
Yeah, very good, thanks. Very good. We just said, where should we start? This is a monumentous thing within football, isn't it? I'm not quite sure where to start. Maybe a lot of people who are listening are perhaps not completely into their football, or perhaps they don't really understand the context of how important this is. So, do you want to start right from the beginning, Mark? What have we seen since the announcement on Sunday last week?
So, I think why this is such an important story and why I think it's good to have this podcast and just to go through this is because I think there might be a lot of people going, oh, cool, football fans, they're suddenly engaged about something, or it's just all football in the media. But actually to recognise why this is quite a significant moment. So there's a long history behind this, and I think we can explore that a bit later. But in 1992, there was two major breaks from tradition within England and in European football. So the Premier League was formed in 1992, which was a break away from the Football League. And it was a new way of setting up football and giving power to the 20 clubs that are in the Premier League. So they control the money and the media revenues that come in. And therefore gave less redistribution of those revenues to the rest of the football pyramid. And that was facilitated by the FA, which is a separate body, Football Association, which is a separate body from the Football League, and the power relations that sort of come with that, or the power conflict. At the same time, the Champions League was formed by UEFA, which is the European Football Association, and that was a break from the former European Cup, which was a cup competition which had teams playing each other. One gets knocked out and they progress up until the final. And the clues in the name Champions League it was the champions of a league, and the league, it was a league format. So those clubs would play each other in a league, which meant more games, which meant more television revenue, which gave more money to those in the competition. Over time, that's expanded, and there's not just champions anymore. There's up to four from a country, for example. So those are the roots, and that was 1992. 90s created sort of a shift in fan movements. I think we can also add Hillsborough into post-Hillsborough into that as well. Fans saying, well, actually, we deserve a voice. These things are changing. It's not necessarily in the direction we want. And it's been complicated. So that's a very potted history of where we start, potentially. But then suddenly something shifted this weekend. Now, the Champions League format has been tinkered with slightly, and UEFA and the leading clubs have been pushing for a change to the format So about increasing from 32 to 36 clubs. So, and then having something called the Swiss model, which was where teams would be in a sort of longer league format, but they would be playing each other, not necessarily within a group, but based on a random sort of draw. But what it meant was, rather than a number of pools or mini leagues of 4 clubs, which meant that they played each other 6 times, 3 home and 3 away, the Swiss model meant that they would be playing 10 games, and it wouldn't be the same people within a league format, but playing more randomly. But then the teams that win and have more points, then the top 8, I think it would be, would then 16 would then be going through. Then it's in the knockout stages. So what that meant is more games. So the clubs themselves will be playing more games. So from 6 to 4 at a minimum, plus and obviously more games if those teams go through. And that meant more television revenue, more money, which then obviously on the basis of that upsets the equality within European leagues. So automatically that UEFA change was about shifting power to the bigger clubs anyway. And what we can see since 92 to now anyway has been the bigger clubs, the clubs that have the most resources, can buy the best players who then do better in their leagues, who then get more sponsorship money and more television money. And then if they do well in Europe, they play more games, which they get money from the Champions League. And that means that they can then invest that in the team and do better in the domestic competition. And then what happens is the bigger leagues, the bigger clubs from the bigger leagues do better in Europe because they have bigger television revenues and sponsorship packages. And what we see is that effectively the winners of the Champions League in recent years have been from England, Germany, Spain. We still haven't had one since the 90s from France, and AC Milan, Inter was 2010, I think 2011. So we've had some, Italy hasn't been winning for a while either. So what we're seeing is a restructuring of those and a worry from those clubs about whether they can still make the money, whether they're still going to be in the competition. But what we can also see is that successful clubs historically, like Ajax in the Netherlands or Benfica in Portugal, they're not getting a look in because they just can't generate the revenue domestically to be able to compete in the Champions League. So it's automatically already structurally an unequal situation. But what caused Sunday was another sort of dimension to this, which was that the 12 clubs that broke away, the 12 who consider themselves to be the elite clubs, the biggest clubs, and that's partly on history and partly on revenue, they felt that the UEFA deal wasn't going to give them enough control and enough money, enough power, effectively. So they agitated to move away. Now, this is something that the big clubs have consistently done. So part of the reason why the Champions League started in 92 was because of pressure from big clubs, including AC Milan. But it's a way of, and it was the same way with the Premier League in 1992, the big 5 at the time in England, which was Liverpool, Everton, Manchester United, Arsenal and Spurs. They were saying, right, we're going to break away, and then they did. So it's a technique that the bigger clubs use to try to force more concessions, and they obviously were using this as a strategy behind the scenes. It's something that obviously had been being developed. But then what made this such a monumental change was, rather than this being political machinations happening behind the scenes through conversations, through meetings, it was then announced that this was going to happen. It was announced that, right, they are breaking away. And that's why it's such a monumental shift and why it's created such a lot of interest in the media and amongst fans and provoked such a reaction, because fundamentally what it did was signal that these clubs are actually only interested in generating money, and actually weren't talking about competition, weren't talking about fans or communities or even the players. They were only focused on money, and they wanted to keep the money for themselves. And why that's significant and why this was such a big rupture is because the Super League, and it's been called the European Super League, and it's not, it's currently European clubs, but it's actually, their branding was the Super League. And that's part of why this is such a seismic event, is as soon as you shift this to a closed league, which is what they wanted to do, and you start to separate it from geography, then the possibility is that this then becomes a global league, that it becomes a possibility that these clubs become franchises. So many of the owners of these clubs, for example, Chelsea's owned by Russian, Israeli citizen Abramovich. Man City's owned by royal family of Abu Dhabi. Other clubs like Liverpool, Manchester United by Americans. There's nothing to stop these owners then moving these clubs to New York, to Abu Dhabi, to Moscow, for example. And that, whilst that might not happen immediately, it's something that could happen. And also, even if they don't move the clubs, they could still move the games around the world, because part of this is about attracting a global audience. And the other significant shift in this was that it was a closed league. So all the revenue was going to be circulated within the 20 clubs within this competition. The 12 that broke away on Sunday, they offered it to Borussia Dortmund, Bayern Munich and Paris Saint-Germain as an extra 3 as founding members. And then they would invite another 5 clubs. But they still wanted to be part of their domestic competition. So if they were generating this increased billions of revenue, that would then upset domestic competition. But it also undermined fundamentally what sport is and football has been about since its codification back in the 19th century, which is that any football club in this country and in Europe could conceivably win the Champions League. It might take a lot of time and a lot of investment, but they could, because it was all about results on the pitch. Is our team could win and they do really well and they get promoted and promoted and promoted and promoted, and then they get into Europe and then they win in Europe. It's a possibility. This is a closed league, which meant that no one was going to get relegated or promoted. And fundamentally, it meant that this elite competition was exclusive to most people in the world. And it really comes down to the fact that this was about money, this was about power, and it was about exclusion of most of football, including the fans. And that's why it was such a seismic event.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. I wanted to pick up on 2 things that you just mentioned there, because you talked about the consultation, who was actually consulted, and then also this idea of a closed league and competition. So starting with the consultation, because this is something that really angered the fans and others within the football world. Who was actually in the meeting, if you like? Who was allowed to know the plans before they were released, and who was excluded?
Well, I think this is why it's interesting sociologically, because this is about power in action. This is about seeing how organisations operate, and to a certain extent how capitalism operates, because this isn't just about the free market operating and just seeing where the money goes. This is about individuals who are working on developing a system that excludes other people in order for them to benefit. And who was in the meetings? Well, it's hard to say. But the ringleaders behind this are Andrea Agnelli, who is the president of Juventus Football Club in Turin in Italy, and one of the most successful club in Italy. He was also on the UEFA Executive Committee, and he was also chair of what was called the European Clubs Association. Now, this is an association of about 200 of the biggest clubs or the most powerful clubs in men's football. And this grew out of a group called the G14, which was the 14 biggest clubs back in the 90s. And this group was the one that agitated and pushed and lobbied to get the Champions League back in the 90s. So it was so we can sort of see some parallels here of how the Champions League came about. I.e., we're the big clubs, we'll break away if you don't do what we want. And then they effectively got UEFA to do what they want. So we can see how power operates, how these organisations, these clubs, but more importantly, it's not the clubs, it's the presidents and owners of these clubs who are agitating for change, pushing the federations, pushing the regulatory bodies, and basically colluding to develop their own process or their own competition that effectively gives them more money. So Andrea Agnelli was sort of a key part of this. So what we can see here is that he had a role within the UEFA's executive committee and as chair of the European Clubs Association, which in theory is fighting for or lobbying for the rights and voice of 200 clubs. And at the same time, behind the scenes, he was also then lobbying for 15 of those clubs to the exclusion of all the others. The other prominent person within this is Florentino Perez, who is the president of Real Madrid in Spain. And he's very much become the public's face recently, which has been sort of making various pronouncements. And both of them seem to be sort of arguing that, well, we're actually going to redistribute some money, so it's actually good for football. And actually it's about young people, and young people don't watch football. And therefore we're trying to create a competition that attracts young people onto their smartphones and tablets and engages them in a different way. And again, what they haven't noticed is that the structural factors of why young people don't go to football, because since the 1990s, since the Premier League and the Champions League, ticket prices have risen astronomically. Kits and commercial activities have risen astronomically. So rather than actually attracting young people through the gates with cheaper tickets, they're still charging 40, 60 euros, 80 euros for tickets to go to games, which prices out most people, not just young people. But they decided that rather than do things like that, and rather than sort of lobby to change regulations around football stadiums or even the policing around stadiums that puts people off going, they're going to change the format and try and do things differently. So I think what's also clear through this is the other two prominent people seem to be Joel Glazer at Manchester United, who's the American owner of Manchester United, and the Fenway Group, which owns Liverpool, and another American company. And drawing on the American model of sport, Major League Baseball, NBA, international basketball, NFL, American football, and ice hockey, NHL, they have closed leagues, closed structures, no relegation, franchises that are bought and sold. They're basically businesses, and if a club wants to move, then they can move to a different city if the city sort of makes it attractive for them. So these are the leading ones. Within this, it feels like Chelsea and Manchester City sort of possibly coming along to say, okay, well, it's better to be in than out because we don't want to be outside if it does get set up. Arsenal and Spurs, definitely. AC Milan, Inter in Italy, a little bit like that. Atletico Madrid and Barcelona in Spain also like that. But I think it's also worth noting that all of these clubs have massive debts, and potentially this is a way of alleviating those debts by bringing in a massive investment, because behind the scenes, how this is getting invested, how this is getting, where the revenue is coming from, it seems, is a JP Morgan hedge fund, as opposed to, there doesn't seem to be any media deals that have been set up. There doesn't seem to be any sponsorship partnerships that have been set up. So it's coming from a bank investing in this as a scheme, And this is why it's also very interesting. And who was in those meetings is there doesn't seem to have been any media companies in those meetings. They don't seem to have set up any sponsorship deals. They've purely gone, right, this is what we can do and we're going to do it. Now, why this is interesting sociologically is because, again, it's how power operates. I would say Gramscian sense, or C. Wright Mills wrote in The Power Elite about these powerful organizations operating together. They're in the same social circles, the same social networks. But we can also see that there is a history to this, particularly within sport, where the Olympics, for example, and the FIFA, the World Cup, changed their revenue streams by having corporate partners. And FIFA in particular in the 1970s, they basically said, rather than, right, we'll sell football as a news story to every media company, we'll sell it as a dedicated entertainment package to the highest bidder. But they also said that we'll do the same thing with sponsorship. So rather than just say, well, we'll just take any sponsorship from anywhere, they restricted who they would sponsor with. And the parallel here is that Horst Dassler, who was part of Adidas and then set up Adidas France, and his business partner, Patrick Barclay, had negotiated and worked their networks with Coca-Cola in particular, also with Pepsi, and then invited those to have the exclusive rights to sponsor the World Cup. Pepsi never got back to them, but Coca-Cola did. Now, these conversations didn't just happen. You don't just send an email and then they go, yeah, this is an idea. It required meetings, it required conversations, it required networking. And these meetings and conversations take place over a period of time. What I find sociologically interesting about what happened with the Super League is it feels like the conversations happened amongst the owners, but not with anyone else. And they didn't seem to get their ducks in a row to lobby within UEFA to get, or the European Clubs Association, or in the media to get, or even in politics to get anyone on their side. And then what's happened is basically the kickback has been so powerful where you've got fans and players and politicians and other clubs all kicking back very quickly and very clearly. And I think this is how, for me, why it's interesting is you can see how power is operating, but also how social movements happen. What's Jasper and Goodwin call a moral shock. There was a moral shock on Sunday. This is happening. This is challenging how we see the world and how we see our sport. And there's been a massive reaction. And they just didn't prepare the ground for that. They didn't, they hadn't prepared the media. They hadn't been putting out stories. They've got a Twitter account that they haven't posted anything on. They had branding that looked like it was knocked up in an afternoon. So they hadn't prepared. And I think that's why it's quite interesting because, and these individuals are trying to game the system for themselves. But in this case, they hadn't done it very well.
Mm. And part of that operation of power, you've already kind of alluded to it in terms of this idea of the competition. And I say competition in the loosest sense of the words, because if there is no relegation, no movement up, no movement down, that isn't competition. That isn't competition. And do you think that was arguably the biggest point that the fans couldn't get their head around or they disliked?
I think it's part of it, because I think what it does is it fundamentally misunderstands what fandom is about. Because what they seem to perceive to be the case and what people want to see, and there will be people out there who want to see this, which is potentially the best players playing each other on a regular basis. Now, that doesn't necessarily make things better. It might bring in more money and maybe more sports science and better coaching and things like that. But it can also create quite a staid, sort of repetitive situation. One of the things of why sport is exciting is because it is competitive. The unpredictability of it is also what makes it exciting. Sport, games, play leisure. They are actually us making things harder for ourselves. Going for a walk isn't necessarily a sport, but if you suddenly, or going for a jog even isn't a sport, but if you suddenly say, right, you've got to do it quicker, or you put in some hurdles in the way, you're suddenly adding an element of risk or unpredictability into it. Now, one of the reasons why people like football is because it's unpredictable. Things happen. We admire the skill, but equally, your team could win on that day. If they all play really well and the other team has a bad day, you could win. And that's exciting. And that drives from competition. It's the paradox is that actually, the competition would actually push people to do things in different ways. And once you take that away, you take away the excitement. You take away a lot of the reason why people are actually engaged in their sport, because most people around the world actually don't support these big 12 or 15 clubs. They support their local football team or another football team that isn't winning everything. And that's the case, is that there's most football teams around the world don't win things.
Yeah.
And in a season, can only be one team that finishes top. But most fans keep coming back because it's not just about who's winning. It's about your social connections. It's your friends. It's your family. You're going for the excitement, for just having a beer with your mates. And that social aspect gets completely taken out of this particular situation, because one is, when you've got a closed league, only a small number of people can go to those games. If they then start moving them around the world, that makes it even harder to then emotionally attach to that club, because you can't physically go there. Or the only ones who can are those who can afford to fly around the world or fly around Europe to go and see these games, which, aside from the environmental impact of that, actually closes off these matches and this competition to most fans. Who then restricted to watching it on television, which creates a different engagement. So what they've done is fundamentally misunderstand why people are attached to their football club, or even just how they want to be a fan and how they see football in general.
Yeah, I totally agree. I thought there's a certain sense of irony. So on the day that actually it started to collapse, 2 days later, my team Brighton were playing at Chelsea. They got a credible point. They could have won, actually. Probably deserved to win. 24 years ago, Brighton were one game away from dropping out the entire football pyramid. And within the space of a quarter of a decade, they're playing in the top league. And I dare say we will drop down again at some point as well. But that is the beauty of football, isn't it? That is the beauty of football. And someone said to me, but as a Brighton fan, if they shut the trap door tomorrow so Brighton couldn't be relegated from the Premier League, you'd take it, wouldn't you? My answer was no. Well, the only reason Brighton's been interesting to watch the last few seasons is because we're always teetering on the edge of could we stay up, could we go down? And honestly, I cannot see the point of watching them week in, week out if we couldn't be relegated.
It also comes down to the point of, well, where would you sit within that hierarchy? Has Arsenal and Spurs been invited basically to be the whipping boys? Are they going to enjoy just losing every game? Some teams don't mind getting relegated because you actually start winning games a bit more often. We've spoken before, but I support Whitehawk in East Brighton. We've got relegated a couple of times in the last 2 years. What it's meant is, some new stadiums to go to, some new fans to go to. They're actually a little bit more local as well, so we don't have to travel so far. So it just creates a very different environment, and there's different reasons and motivations why people go to football. Some of it is about winning, and we want to win. That's why we like it, but it's not the be all and end all.
No, actually, I was at one of those games, going off point a little bit. Whitehawk, when they got relegated at the end of the season, I think the other team drew 2-2 or something like that. But what was really interesting watching that Whitehawk game was the singing continued, the drinking and the smiling continued, whatever. It wasn't about winning and staying up. People go to the football for a lot more reasons than just the winning, as you've already mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is, and again, why I think football fandom is an interesting object of inquiry sociologically, because effectively what you're seeing is, is how groups form, who we are, who you are, what we do, what the rules of our engagement are, that subculture within that, and how you see the world and how you engage with other people. And football is a very popular sport, but it's regular. It's till this last year, you could go every game or every other week rather, to watch a game. So you see these things on a regular basis. You see the same faces. You learn the rituals, the singing, the clapping, whatever happens at those games. And that's what builds an emotional attachment. So effectively what Emil Durkheim wrote in Elementary Forms, this is a ritual that generates the emotional connection to the group. And it becomes symbolized in the football club. And we then wrap it up in a lot of other things like community, like sociability. And that's what we are. We're social animals. And once you start taking that away, then it becomes, they're fundamentally striking at the core of what is a really important activity for millions of people.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
And I already mentioned it didn't take long for this to start to collapse. Within 48 hours, we saw the first club, Chelsea, pull the plug, and then the whole stack of cards started to fall. I'd like to think, Mark, I'd like to believe this was down to fan power. And fans did have some impact, but there was much more to this. So what do you think started to drive the collapse of this in a relatively short period of time?
Well, two things. What is... I personally think, and I would love to see more details of this, and I'm not sure that we ever will because of it comes back to who was in the meetings. I don't think we're going to get much out of that, but it felt very amateurish from the start. I mean, from the logo, the fact that this was announced at about 11 o'clock on a Sunday evening. So there had been a news story in the New York Times and in the Times in England, sort of suggesting that this was happening, and almost like they went, oh, right, bloody hell, we've got to do this now. And they did it, and it was sort of announced. And then that was it. And it was like, if you're going to do something like this, you would, again, as a professional, you would think, right, okay, we're going to do this at 2 o'clock. We're going to have a press conference, or, maybe even not, 11 o'clock, midday, you're going to have a press conference so that you've got all the journalists there who've got your story and your side of the story. You're going to have all your branding in place. You're going to be transparent about where the money's coming from and saying, right, okay, this is how it's going to be operating. This is how it's going to structure. And they didn't seem to have any of that. They had some quite amateurish branding. They had the communications wasn't working and doesn't seem to be, and then they didn't even have any spokespeople out there to sort of field the questions. So the first person to have to deal with questions was Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, the manager of Manchester United, who was asked after their game on Sunday, and he was like, well, I don't really know. And then that continued the following night. Liverpool was playing, and their manager Jurgen Klopp was suddenly being interviewed and fielding the questions. So the directors, the CEOs, the presidents weren't out there explaining their story. They were sort of just leaving it to players and managers to field these questions, who in those, especially in Klopp's case, was quite saying he didn't agree with it. So that automatically undermines your process and what you're trying to achieve. And then Andrea Agnelli seemed to have turned his phone off or was incommunicado over the last couple of days, so no one was getting hold of him. So this is someone who was an ex-co-member of UEFA and chair of the European Club Association, and then also duplicitously setting this up and then just disappearing. It was just badly managed from that side. But then equally, it was big, as I say, I've seen this on social media. Why don't fans do this about the NHS or tackling racism? And it's the moral shock aspect. Is fans have been doing things about the NHS, and fans have been collecting for food banks, and they've been doing lots of other things for their communities. There's some idiots out there, and there's racists out there, as there are in society. But just like with Black Lives Matter a year ago, people have been challenging racism, but then it took the murder of George Floyd to then suddenly become that moral shock to go, this is horrific, and suddenly opening people's eyes a bit, and opening a broader number of eyes onto what the problem is. And the same thing happened here, is that the greed, the commercialism has been slowly increasing since the 90s, but this was sort of quite a fundamental seismic shift to no, we're doing this purely for money, not for competition, not for fans, not for players. It's purely for us, and we're going to close everything off. And that's what the kickback was. And it was that moral shock, and fans did kick off, creating quite a voice. The media had no story, and I'm guessing quite a lot, judging by social media, a lot of the journalists also disagreed with this as a situation anyway. Players started to, they were a bit slower, but they started to push back as well. And if they're clever, they're probably the ones going, right, okay, the fans are kicking back. This is our opportunity to be seen to be the good guys. Because there will be some players who go, right, if I could make a couple of extra million a year by playing in this league, they'll be there. But most players won't be. And for those people, potentially their salaries fall. And also then suddenly, I think when you start seeing the fan movement, the media direction, the politicians then start coming out of the woodwork and going, oh, well, yes, we support, we don't support this. This is a bad thing. Even though these are the same politicians who've been supporting free market capitalism and these sort of, acquisitions and deregulated commercialism for 40 years. And they suddenly realize, we're better support the fans. So I think the fans did have a big voice in this. But there are also lots of other factors that come into play.
Certainly. And maybe I could make this the final question for you, Mark. We're now a few days on from it, and there's been many calls from various different factions about that there must be a punishment to this. That this can't just be swept under the carpet and we move on. So kind of a two-pronged question, if you like. What do you think the punishment should be? And secondly, do you actually think there will be a punishment?
That's a good question, because I think, will there be a punishment? We've got to move on. I mean, first and foremost, we have to move on. This has woken people up. It's got everyone moving and talking. We're moving together in the same direction. And one of the things about football fans is often that they can compete against each other, but actually where the successes have been of when fans have realised that they have more in common. So that could be about ownership. It could be about racism. It could be about, just general governance of the sport. And this week we've seen that fans gone, yep. Even the fans of the clubs that would have been in this closed league were something like, we don't want to be part of this, and we all worked in the same direction. So, but that was also meant that the UEFA changes, which automatically brought in more money for the bigger clubs, or for those in European competition, and that means more power. That was voted through. So the timing of Sunday was the day before that UEFA approved their changes, and that's gone through without much of a criticism. And I think we need to return and remember that is the changes to the Champions League wasn't for the benefit of most football clubs. It was only for the benefit of a small number that were in Europe. So there's still resistance to be done there. It's opened people's eyes that something needs to happen. So hopefully fans, and the fact that politicians, and particularly in England, have said, the government have said they're going to have a review, and there are even discussions about fans on boards and revisions of governance. And that's where we need to be aiming for, because what we're seeing here, and why this, for those who may be listening to this who hate football, what football has done this week is illustrated how neoliberal capitalism operates. It's how a small number of people can acquire and accumulate the resources, and that can exclude vast numbers of the population, and that may be for other football clubs, but it also can be fans of those football clubs. And what football is a metaphor for here is, well, actually, what we need is more regulation to balance out those inequities, to balance out just the, because if you want to have a more competitive and equal society, more equal society, then there is some competition in there. It's not just about who can acquire the most resources and then keep themselves there. And that requires regulation. And then what we're seeing now is calls for that regulation and getting fans on boards, maybe moderating the power of a lone owner who can do what they want with the club, and potentially putting in regulations about whether they can move the club or how they operate and what competitions they operate in. So potentially this opens up a whole new era of regulation in how political economy operates in Britain and Europe. And that potentially is quite an interesting debate. This might be a door opening to something. And therefore that comes back to your question, Matthew, about sanctions and will there be any payback? Now, this is going to be the interesting thing, because lots of people were talking about sanctioning the clubs. And this is where it becomes complicated with football clubs, because you penalise the clubs, you're penalising the players and the fans. And I think there's a very visceral reaction that most people want those clubs penalised. There's been discussions around maybe fining the owners, because it's the owners that are the problem here. But as I said earlier, those clubs are all based in millions in debt. So all that would happen, no matter how big the fine, you're basically putting more debt on that club. Those directors themselves aren't going to be paying these fines. I'm pretty certain of that. They'll find ways around it. So it's not going to dent these billionaires' investments or incomes or their money in any way, shape, or form, their wealth in any way, shape, or form. So the way to actually sanction them, in my view, is to force them to give up their power within their clubs and force them to actually have proper governance, to actually have fans to have a voice. Because the only way that these individuals will recognise and lose out is by losing some of their power. And that power has to be ceded to players and to fans. And that's, to me, as what we fight for, is a proper governance regime, a proper fan democracy, that these organisations become democratic, that fans have a voice, and other stakeholders, including players, have a voice. And that's the way that these clubs, these owners, will be sanctioned, is because they try to accumulate even more power, and what we have to do is take that away.
Certainly. I think you mentioned in an interview I did with you before about the German model, and I know that's been talked a lot about, hasn't it? Whether that's one route to take, whether the fans have, is it at least 51% ownership?
Well, in Germany, it's the members of the club have 50% plus one share, so that no one person can take them over. And obviously fans can become members. Not all fans own the club, but it's potentially, that's something that I've seen mooted. Oliver Dowden, the sport minister, even mentioned that, which is quite a monumental shift from where we were. And to me, that would be the ultimate sanction on these clubs. Is you go, right, you're going to do that, then you lose something here, and the fans then have a voice. Yeah, and
something else fans can do. I'm sure you'd agree, Mark. We're hoping in June, back to football. Put the money back into non-league. Go and watch your local club, your non-league club. I'll catch you at a White Hawk game, certainly. But that really is something that the fans can do, isn't it? Grassroots football.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, what these owners do is they realise that fans have a passionate and emotional attachment to their club, and they're effectively exploiting that love. And fans do have a choice, and it's hard. Yeah, and it's easy if I've moved from Devon to Brighton, so it's slightly easier because geographically it's harder to go back to watch Plymouth Argyle. But non-league is a space, and there's been a whole range of non-league clubs on social media saying we'll welcome you. We're not going to be going and breaking away anywhere. It's cheaper, it's more social, it's more fun. You get to know the players get to know you. You can actually have conversations with the manager. It's a totally different type of football, and it's more fun in some ways, and I would definitely advocate for that. That you don't have to spend all this money going to these clubs. And that potentially is another way of hitting these clubs, which is hitting them in the pocket where you go, right, okay, why do I have to support Spurs? I could support Haringey Burrows just down the road, or non-league clubs like Whitehawk. They're there. There's alternative models. Manchester United fans did this when they first had a challenge against the Glazers who own them, and set up FC United of Manchester, as a democratic model where they all have a voice. There's other ways of doing this, and it can be hard, but I would also say the rewards are there because it's much more enjoyable and more fun.
Well, it's a good positive spin. I'm hoping something positive comes out of quite a bizarre and awkward situation. Mark, I really want to just say thank you for giving up your time and at short notice as well to come and explain that. And I hope even sort of non-football fans have learned quite a fair bit from that as well.
Pleasure. Thanks, Matthew. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Take care now.
Cheers.
The Sociology Show podcast relies on the kind contributions of sponsorship and donations. If you enjoy the show, then you can help with the hosting costs by donating as little as £5 on the GoFundMe page. Simply visit uk.gofundme.com and search for the Sociology Show. If you can donate, then you will be sent a Sociology Show pen as a small thank you for your continued support of the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email the Sociology Show podcast@gmail.com.